Fellow citizens, I drank musty ale at the Illinois Athletic Club with the millionaire manufacturer of Green River butter one night, and his face had the shining light of an old-timer Quaker who spoke of a beautiful daughter, and I knew he had a peace and a happiness up his sleeve somewhere. Then I heard Jim Kirch make a speech to the Advertising Association on the trade resources of South America, and the way he lighted a 3-for-a-nickel stogie and cocked it at an angle regardless of the manners of our best people. I knew he had a clutch on a real happiness, even though some of the reporters on his newspaper say he is the living double of Jack London's Seawolf. In the mayor's office, the mayor himself told me he was happy, though it is a hard job to satisfy all the office seekers and eat all the dinners he is asked to eat. Down in Gilpin Place, near Hull House, was a man with his jaw wrapped for a bad toothache, and he had it all over the butter millionaire, Jim Kirch, and the mayor when it came to happiness. He is a maker of accordions and guitars, and not only makes them from start to finish, but plays them after he makes them. And he had a guitar of mahogany with a walnut bottom he offered for $7.50 if I wanted it, and another just like it, only smaller, for $6, though he never mentioned the price till I asked him, and he stated the price in a sorry way, as though the music and the make of an instrument count for 1,000,000 times more than the price in money. I thought he had a real soul and knew a lot about God. There was light in his eyes of one who has conquered sorrow, in so far as sorrow is conquerable or worth conquering. Anyway, he's the only Chicago citizen I was jealous of that day. He played a dance they play in some parts of Italy when the harvest of grapes is over and the wine presses are ready for work. Again, that was Fellow Citizens by Carl Sandburg. Hello and welcome back to the library after a brief hiatus. And before we get lost amongst the stacks on this sweltering-ass day, I want to introduce my guest, Mr. Vernacular Spectacular himself. He's back again, baby. Davis Peck. How are you doing today, Davis?
Oh, not too shabby. And yourself? It's fucking balls hot, though. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's pretty rough. And how do you feel living in a time where we have the smartest president to ever live of all time, according to the biggest idiots I've ever heard seen?
It's not boring, I'll tell you that.
Well, today we're going to be talking about somebody who wasn't one of the smartest people of all time, but he is a pretty intelligent person in his own way. And to be frank, he's one of America's greatest poets in the 20th century. Somebody who I've had the privilege to read a lot of his works, as old copies of his books have been found readily and accessible still, and somebody who is referred to as the people's poet. And yes, this guy is way cooler than Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Today, we are going to be talking about Carl Sandburg, who is pretty based all his life, if I have to say so myself. Have you heard anything about him?
No, I have not heard about Carl Sandburg.
Well, I mean, realistically, you probably have. And I wanted this to be a shorter script because I didn't expect there to be that much about him, but I wrote over 6,300 words and more than 12 pages, single space, so here we go. Carl Sandburg was born on January 6, 1878. His father was August Sandburg, and his mother was Clara Matilda Sandburg, née Anderson. His parents were both Swedish immigrants who moved to the United States for eventually finding a better life, like most Swedes did in the late 19th century, and they moved to the American Middle West, as what was referred to at the time. His father worked as a railroad man, as a section hand, working for several different railroad companies, including Chicago Railroad Company, the Burlington Northern Railroad Company, no relation, and Quincy Railroad Company, which I think ends up being just Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad Company in one, and they merged, but I don't really know, and honestly, those mergers are pretty ridiculous. You're a railroad guy yourself, right? You're a train dude?
So they say. I mean, I'm not up on my railroad companies, though. I do know Burlington Northern and Quincy did merge, but that's all I got.
Yeah, I think he might have worked for just one of them, but I got a little confusing based off the syntax of whoever the author was of his biography. It's speculated that August so Carl's father, changed his last name to be Sandburg because his original last name was far more common in Swedish and common at the time for the railroad workers. And this being the time before direct deposit and, frankly, any form of photo identification, his father's paycheck would be picked up by a different person more than once. His last name was either Johnson or Danielson, most likely Johnson, but I've seen both. But it isn't really well known anymore. So in order for him to get the correct paycheck, he promptly changed his name to make it as little as like possible, and he changed it to Sandburg, spelled Sandberg, which apparently was a unique enough name. Changing your name back then was as simple as asking your employer at the time to just put a different name on paper. There was no lengthy court filings. There was no other formalities needed. And I'm not sure where he got the name from either, only that I think he said that made him stick out a bit more than just one of the many August Johnsons lumbering around the railroad yards back in the day, probably eating Swedish meatballs and definitely wearing enormous chef hats. The Sandbergs were poor, a hardworking family, and Carl and his 6 siblings grew up in a 3-room cottage in Galesburg, Illinois, which at the time of his birth was a small city of about 10,000 people, and according to the 2020 census, it's now around 30,000, which is sizable enough compared to the cities in our state where we live. But, it's slightly lower than it was in its apex in the 1960s at 37,000. So just kind of one of those at the tail end of the Rust Belt cities. It's currently located basically right in the middle of northwestern Illinois, closer to Iowa and Peoria, much closer to Peoria than Chicago. Galesburg is actually an interesting town. It's one of those small cities with a uniquely American and pretty fascinating history. But before we get on to that, any comments or questions about him?
No, just seems like typical Midwestern navvy or navvy family working for the railroads. Nothing too out of the ordinary so far.
Yeah, so Galesburg, it's named after this guy named George Washington Gale. Anything popping up right now?
Washington. It's just anybody whose first 2 names are George Washington something. There's it's going to be some sort of psychosis going on there.
I mean, I actually didn't pick up when he was born because this must have been right after Revolutionary War, because George Washington Gale was a New York Presbyterian minister. His claim to fame is he started the Oneida Institute of Science and Industry in Utica. Yeah. Which was the famous first school to accept both black and white students who would live pretty much unsegregated, which of course was super radical and sometimes even caused violent opposition by locals or non-locals, realistically. Along with it being basically an unsegregated school, it was a hotbed for the abolitionist movement. It was one of those early examples of a manual labor college, which sounds a lot less. It sounds a lot more nefarious than it actually really is. It's just one of the first ones that was conceived as. Simply, a labor college is a tertiary school that believes that a physical education and a vocation, typically agriculture or mechanical based, it should be the foremost of the education, with academic education supplementing. The Oneida Institute had a short run. It was from 1827 to 1843, but it was the direct predecessor of Oberlin, Lane Cemetery, and Knox College, which we'll be talking about shortly. You know much about Oneida? Probably a little bit, right?
A little bit. It does beg the question. You mentioned the universities that trace their lineage back to that, but how many of the cults in the Burned-Over district start there, too?
Well, I don't know if it was the Oneida Institute itself that had started the cult, because there was an Oneida community.
Like that whole region is like the American revivalist heartland between the Holy Rollers, Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons. That's where you start.
Yeah, you get the Shakers too, and not only the Seventh-day Adventists, but there was another. No, it was the Seventh Day. I'm thinking of the woman who saw visions in her dreams or something like that. Yeah, forgot her name. She was also a Vermonter, I think. A lot of these people were Vermonters. Now, because George Washington Gale wasn't satisfied with just living in central New York, just outside of the Adirondacks, for one thing, it was cold as hell there. Another, as somebody who absolutely loves snow, that area redefines being snowed in. Those two things I said weren't really reasons that he would stated. They're just facts. What Gale wanted was to start another manual labor college, and his dream was somewhere near the Mississippi River Valley. So he began to publicize and sell a subscription and land purchase-based plan to found this college and this new, basically, institution. It almost sounds like a cult, but it isn't, technically. By 1837, he stepped down from being the president of the United Institute, took a bunch of followers on a pretty wild journey through America's first major canal projects. Of course, this was westward expansion, so a lot of people died on the journey, and settled in the first people to the land we now know as Galesburg, Illinois, named after him. Of course, there was Native American tribes that were living at the time, probably the Dakota, but it could be somebody else. There, he started what we refer to as Knox College, named after the county. Today, it's a private liberal arts college with around 1,100 students, which is tiny.
Pretty small school. Where'd you say it was founded? Located?
It's in Galesburg.
Oh, just right in Galesburg?
Now, this is completely not relevant to the story, but I did, while looking at some research, Galesburg was also hometown of one George Washington Gale Ferris Jr., who had no direct relation to George Washington Gale. He was just named after him again, even though G. Dub Gale was alive when G. Dub G. Ferris Jr. was born, which means that there was a G. Dub George Washington Gale Sr., who was named after G. Dub G. as well, when he was still a very young man, because, think about that for a second when it comes down to that genealogy. It's just weird. Anyway, Ferris Jr. would invent the Ferris wheel.
Oh, I'm just picturing naming a baby after a 5-year-old. Be like, yep, that was a good one. We're gonna do it again.
Imagine just seeing there's just a person in your hometown that constantly is named after somebody else in your hometown. So there's a George Washington Ferris Bueller, George Washington Ferris Bueller, you know what I mean? Galesburg Jr., George Washington, Gale, Ferris Bueller, Schmidt, Jones. They'll have to be last names from here on end. What I found interesting and unique of this town of Galesburg is right from the get-go, it's just a haven for abolitionists, as well as a stop for the Underground Railroad. Knox College was even the site of the 5th Lincoln-Douglas debate. Lincoln here definitely having the home field advantage for once. This was a massively positive influence on Carl Sandburg, we're going to talk about later. Now, Carl would attend school in town where he was known as a sensitive boy who just wanted to fit in. One of the things he did to do that was he changed the spelling of his last name. He changed from B-E-R-G to B-U-R-G to better reflect the town Galesburg. His older 2 siblings did this as well. They also thought it made him sound more American for some reason, though honestly there's really no difference. I think B-E-R-G would be more of the Swedish spelling too, but there you go. I don't think there's any Berg like that with Sandburg anywhere that's Swedish, but I could be wrong. He started going by Charles or Charlie instead of Carl. Some Swedes in town had a difficult time pronouncing the ch sound, one of which was his father. So his father would just call his son Charlie from there on end, which it sounds like they must have had a pretty decent relationship in this family, because his father thought it was okay that their kids changed their last names and their first names. And for the sake of the narrative today, we're just going to call him Carl, but for the next several decades, he's going to be referring to himself as Charles or Charlie.
Ooh, more Charlie discourse. Lovely.
His parents taught the kids to be industrious and to love America and believe in the American dream, genuinely. This was probably one of the few times in American history where that couldn't be taken sarcastically. And honestly, blissful ignorance a little bit about what that actually meant to a lot of other people. They also wanted Carl to have an education, but that really wasn't something they could afford, nor was it something that young Carl was really destined for. He wasn't that good at schooling. He left school for the first time after he finished his 8th grade, and from the years of 13 to 17, Carl picked up odd jobs in town to make ends meet to support his family. He would shine shoes. He drove a milk truck starting at the age of 14 to deliver milk and then later newspapers. No, not at the same time. As a porter, he worked in the Union Hotel barber shop, which I didn't know barbershops were in hotels, nor did they need porters. Went back to driving a milk truck again, became a bricklayer at one point, then a farm laborer on the wheat plains of Kansas. At the age of 17, he decided that he wanted to see the world, so he became a hobo. And this is early hobo times in 1895, so he's really at the cutting edge of hoboism here. He traveled to places like Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, and eastern Colorado in search of odd jobs.
Ooh, the most pretty part of the country.
Gotta love that eastern Colorado. His life, along with many others, though, would change one day when a boat sank in Havana Harbor. Of course, I'm talking about the USS Maine, which, this is funny. Somehow it looks like they're $U $Maine because of the way this is printed. Not purposeful at all. Yeah, it's reductionist and not entirely true that the United States got involved in the war against Spain because something internal caused the ship to blow up. A bunch of journalists said that it was torpedoed to try to sell newspapers rather than growing American public and political support to intervene on the behalf of Cubans in their struggle for independence from the Spanish Empire, which would be aligned against the growing American sentiment of manifest destiny, while further proving that the U.S. can flex its military muscle in the Western Hemisphere and propagate the previously impotent Monroe Doctrine. But I'm just going to say, ship go boom, we make killing. And that's what he did. Anything else to add?
So did he go down to Cuba, or did he just enlist and then got sent all over the place?
Great question. And our young protagonist, seeing an opportunity to get the fuck out of Galesburg and Midwest in general, he joined the U.S. Army to fight in the Spanish-American War. He was stationed at Guantanamo Bay. Yeah, which is an unknown area of the world where nothing bad ever happened and doesn't continue to happen, and we don't need to worry about holding land in a sovereign nation and performing enhanced interrogation tactics. All of that may or not may be hypothetically happening around 103 years after he was stationed there, and we don't need to be worried about the fact that completely innocent people are being sent and held for crossing a border to live in some kind of American dream that Americans like the Sandburg family espoused and wanted him to be proud of this very day, mixing them with a group of men who we dubbed personally as terrorists. And all I have to remember is Senator John McCarthy singing Barbara Ann during a campaign speech, but changing the lyrics to bomb, 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 Iran, bomb, 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 Iran.
Listen, in this current political climate, I frankly am concerned that I have to explain to you that black sites matter, okay?
Jesus, okay. But remember when he did that? Pepperidge Farm remembers. Anyway, Sandburg is involved in the invasion of Guanica, Puerto Rico, with the members of the 6th Illinois Infantry, specifically Company C. American forces landed on this part of the island, which is located in the southwestern part, and my wife and I actually stayed in a small resort there during our honeymoon. Totally off the topic. It's a beautiful and very dry for the climate in Puerto Rico in general, which is different in climate a lot else in the island, right? Like you expect Puerto Rico to be very wet because when we went there, there was also a massive rainforest. Guanica itself is a pretty good sized city, a little small town or whatever. Street food we had was great. The resort right outside of it is on a windy, beautiful road, and it's not one of those all-inclusive, you can't leave here because you'll get robbed due to American imperialistic corporate hospitality prices, but I recommend it. I digress. The 6th Illinois Infantry landed, and that's all they did. The American Marines set up light fortifications. There was a very small skirmish, and the Spanish flag was taken down while the American one was raised because the Spanish basically thought the Americans would just go and invade San Juan. But we didn't. Carl didn't even see action, and he spent his entire time, hopefully, and this is just me guessing, chilling in Puerto Rico, hopefully drinking rum, eating mofongo, and dancing to bamba. However, even with the limited action he saw, he still qualified as a veteran. So this really was the best case scenario overall. He returns home to Galesburg, where he enrolls as what the National Park Service site calls, quote, special students. I think this is because he was eligible only because of his status as a veteran, not because he didn't have a high school diploma, right?
Yeah, it just sounds like a catch-all for someone who didn't matriculate.
In 1899, a year after he returns home, he receives an appointment to none other than West Point. And then he wasn't there anymore, because within the months that he was there, he failed both his math and grammar entrance exams. Imagine now a famous writer failing their grammar exams. Who would have thunk it? James Joyce.
Those who can't write do poetry.
or turn into William Faulkner. But I guess that's just the whiskey writing. Sandburg returns back to Lombard, which was a co-educational universalist university located in the hometown of Galesburg that was known as the Illinois Liberal Institute. So imagine this town, when Carl was growing up, had this university, and one started by the guy who created the Oneida Institute to choose from. Carl would attend this school, captain the basketball team, and become editor of the college journal and yearbook. However, he would leave it after 4 years without a diploma. It was difficult to find what he even studied while attending to the school, but what is important is that he began to write and writing poetry specifically while attending. I'd say that college made a damn liberal out of him, but this whole town was pretty much as left as you could have it at this time. Not anymore. According to the National Park Service website again, his first published poem was The Falling Leaves, published at the Galesburg Evening Mail, using the pseudonym just Crimson. He used Crimson. I could not find his poem anywhere, and the only place that this poem was referenced was on the NPS site. Again, I don't think there's any reason for them to have fabricated it, but kind of have to be dubious a little bit, right?
I'm just hung up on 4 years of college and no diploma, because college didn't have a set number of degrees or set number of years back then. It was just, you go until we say you're good, and then you get to leave.
Well, you didn't have credits or anything like that?
They had a course of study, but it was more like a competency thing than anything else. It's just I'm willing to put my name on what you know. Have at it.
Well, that's a good segue, because somebody was willing to put a name on what Carl Sandburg was good at. Because when he attended, he managed to befriend Professor Philip Green Wright. Professor Wright encouraged Sandburg's writing so much that he paid to publish Sandburg's first volume of poetry and a little bit of short prose in a 32-page pamphlet, or 35-page pamphlet called Reckless Ecstasy. It was published in 1904, and Professor Wright even wrote the introduction to the pamphlet. I will add some excerpts from other poems later, because I don't think that there's any from this pamphlet really worth reciting. It's very, very new and kind of more archaic, and I don't think it's a very good example of his writing. But it's all free online if you want to access it, and it's pretty short. After college, Sandburg does a stint selling stereoscopic images for a company called Underwood and Underwood. Which, are you familiar with those anymore? No. So they're images that you can see under a binocular lens that enhances the illusion of depth, right? Modern equivalents are 3D colorful patterns. They're basically fractals, but back then they were actual images of real life in black and white. And if you've ever been, I've been to the Edison Museum, and they've had it there, though Edison wasn't, he probably just stole the idea and ran with it like he usually does, right? Any questions about those?
No, so it's just hyper contrasted photos for
Yeah, and I don't know how they were actually produced, but pretty modern at the time, right? This is 1900. He then moves to Wisconsin. Would you like to take a guess of what the next job he has when he moves to Wisconsin? Anything, Davis?
Brewing. He got into brewing.
That would have been a pretty good guess. Any other one?
Strike breaking. He got into strike breaking.
No, actually, the opposite. I'm going to quote an article from the Wisconsin Academy Review, 1989. It's called Carl Sandburg's and the Steichens, the Wisconsin Years, by Faith B. Miracle. What a name. Faith B. Miracle.
That's a desperate attempt for nominative determinism.
I mean, you either changed that name or you were given it, and either way, then an editor of a children's book would scoff at it, being this is too much. Quote, on December 29, 1907, Carl Sandburg, then calling himself Charles, checked in at 344 North 6th Street on Milwaukee to report on his job as an organizer for the Wisconsin Social Democratic Party. On that same day, party member Lillian Steichen, I believe it's Steichen, younger sister of photographer Edward Steichen, was ending her Christmas visit with her parents in Menominee Falls, thank you, and returning to her teaching position in Princeton, Illinois. She stopped in at party headquarters to say goodbye to her socialist friends and met, by chance, the new party organizer. They talked for a while. He walked her to the trolley, very romantic. So she gave him her address in Princeton, and he promised to send her some samples of his writing. 6 months later, they were married in Milwaukee after a spirited exchange of remarkable letters. Unquote. Now, side note here, because another interesting small world thing, Edward Steichen was a groundbreaking photographer whose photographs are known to be some of the first, or not only some of them, probably the first modern fashion photographs to be ever published back in 1911. He worked for Vogue and Vanity Fair as early as 1923 to 1938, which is way earlier than I expected both of those magazines to be around. One of them has to be over 100 at this point, and then continued to have an illustrious career until his death in 1973 at the age of 93. So small world stuff right there. Now, if you watch any of America's Next Top Model, there's literally like 2 degrees of separation between Tyra Banks and Carl Sandburg.
Oh, damn. Yeah, I mean, I knew Vogue was around for a long time, but I don't know, it's hard to picture like early photographs. Like I always kind of assumed they'd be like sketches, but
again, this is before color photography too. So like that's like crazy to think that he's working with light in such a unique way that they're actually doing.
Yeah, that it's worth putting a black and white photo in a fashion magazine to like sell shit.
It was his wife Lillian who encouraged Charles Sandburg to go back to his Christian name, Carl, while still meeting in the U instead of, still keeping the U instead of the E, which makes sense that a socialist would prefer the name Carl instead of Charles, right? And for some reason that was never explained to Carl, to me, like it was never explained, but Carl would refer to his wife, whose name is Lillian, as Paula for the rest of their lives, which I don't see how those nicknames can stretch at all.
Yeah, no, you strike me more as Paula now, so that's you're Pauline. Just deal with it.
I mean, I think this guy. I mean, this is the last name change he's going to have, but what crazy. Carl's work at the Socialist Democratic Party wasn't fleeting. He was so invested that he worked as a secretary for Emil Seidel, who was the first socialist mayor of Milwaukee, which also means he was the first socialist mayor of any major United States city. This happened from 1910 to 1912. Though later in life, he would not associate himself directly with the Socialist Party anymore. He was just older and didn't do that. He definitely held similar beliefs of this all his life. And I read some intros to some of his books. One of them claimed he was never a socialist, which is blatantly untrue.
Yeah, that's a load of horseshit.
You don't join the Social Democratic Party and they later not called a socialist. And maybe if he were like to renounce it, but like saying never, that's ridiculous. And he never renounced it either. So during his time in Milwaukee, he also worked as an ad man and journalist for a number of papers. His main focus in his writings and in the party was to end child labor, which we're bringing it back, baby. Those little hands are needed more in fitting through those tiny spaces under heavy machinery rather than playing Nintendo Switches. His work as a newspaperman would ultimately take him to the big windy city where he is most associated throughout all of his poetry.
Do you think they had a brand name for Switches for motivating children back in the day? Trying to turn Nintendo Switches into like the rock.
Yeah, it's called porridge. Lunch. Actually, the Sandburgs, from what I could tell, never really lived in Chicago. Rather, they lived in the suburbs outside of Chicago, at one place in Evanston, eventually being in Elmhurst for a while, making a way to Michigan a couple of times, but in and around there. But before we move to his work in Chicago, I will add here that Carl and Lillian had a pretty happy marriage from what I could see. They had 4 daughters between 1911 and 1918, one of which unfortunately passed right after childbirth. The remaining 3 would be close to their father for the rest of their lives. Sandburg took a job working for the Chicago Daily News, where he would work for much of his time while residing in Chicago. In 1914, he was published again, this time in a new magazine called Poetry, a Magazine of Verse, where the editor encouraged him to write his free-form style, and the homely, simple speech would distinguish him from the predecessors and his contemporaries. He would be recognized as a contributing member of the new Chicago literary Renaissance movement, which also included people like Sherwood Anderson, Theodore Dreiser, and Edgar Lee Masters. But what really established his reputation as a poet was when Henry Hold and Company decided to publish arguably his most famous collection of poems, simply known as the Chicago Poems. Does this ring a bell anymore?
Still no bells.
Chicago Poems, published in 1916, was a tradition-shatting tradition shattering. The tradition have been shat on. The tradition shattering book due to its Whitman-esque free verse style. I'm sorry, I'm just thinking of a dog called Tradition shitting all over the ground at the moment.
Yep. Are we getting into like any hunky inspirations at this point?
No, not really. These guys, I mean, honestly, he might have even left Chicago before Hunky was born, but we'll see. No, he was still around for a little bit. They never crossed paths. He's like, they never crossed paths. I think he's like 40 years older than him. So, yeah, the tradition-shattering book due to Whitman-esque freestyle verse, which was controversial to the poetry purists at the time, focused largely on city life and expressed Carl Sandburg's commitment to the masses. This is a side note. I'm just thinking of this now, but nowadays, if you write in like regular verse, anything like that in the United States, people are going to kind of scoff at you. They want free verse. So, oh, how the times have changed. Lots of his poems in all of his books focused on social criticism, basically, and he would write in an active voice as if the poet himself was taking an active role in the poems, describing things like immigrant life, about race relations between white and black people in the 1910s, specifically with the Chicago poems, about soldiers returning from or preparing for war, about structures growing in a blooming city, about mobsters, ironworkers, teamsters, millionaires, and the destitute. The poem I introduced to this podcast, Fellow Citizens, was an example of this work, and I tried to add some more obscure poems intentionally in these scripts, partially because some of his most famous works are very long. But here I will now read probably a poem every American student would have had to read at one time by the time they were in high school. It's just simply known as Chicago. Hog butcher for the world, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and the nation's freight handler, stormy, husky, brawling, city of big shoulders. They tell me you are wicked, and I believe them, for I have seen your painted women under the gas lamps luring the farm boys. And they tell me you are crooked, and I answer, yes, it is true. I have seen the gunmen kill and go free to kill again. And they tell me you are brutal, and my reply is, on these faces of women and children, I have seen the masks of wanton hunger. And having answered, so I turn once more to those who sneer at my city, and I give them back the sneer and say to them, come and show me another city with lifted heads, singing so proud to be alive and coarse and strong and cunning, flinging magnetic curses amid the toil of piling job and job. Here is a tall, bold slugger set, vivid against the little soft cities, fierce as a dog with tongue lapping for action, cunning as a savage pitted against the wilderness, bareheaded, shoveling, wrecking, planning, building, breaking, rebuilding, under the smoke, dust all over his mouth, laughing with white teeth, under the terrible burden of destiny, laughing as a young man laughs, laughing even as an ignorant fighter laughs who has never lost a battle, bragging and laughing that under his wrist is the pulse, and under his ribs the heart of the people, laughing the stormy, husky, brawling laughter of youth, half naked, sweating, proud to be hog butcher, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and freight handler to the nation. Again, that was Chicago by Carl Sandburg. Who else would it be by? Any reaction to that right off the bat?
Yeah. Well, they say that Boston has like a citywide chip on their shoulder, but I feel like Chicago might have us beat.
I mean, yeah, I would say that there is definitely a pride between the two, and like both of them have their own sense of pride. I was thinking that like nowadays Boston would have a similar poem to this. I was very similar when I first read that.
Like all the professions and descriptors would be different, but it would be like the same beat, the same like we do this X Y Z. Like
I don't know. People to this day are incredibly proud of Chicago who are from there. You know how you can tell somebody's from Chicago? They'll tell you, right? And nothing wrong with it. It's the same with Boston, but usually you can tell by the accent on both. The Pope.
The Pope.
How do you feel about being a Bostonian with one of the largest Catholic communities in the entire country, and like the first pope is from fucking Chicago?
Well, I mean, just as long as it wasn't some sort of evangelical convert, we're in business.
Fair enough. I mean, he was he's not a Jesuit, was he?
I think he is a Jesuit.
If memory serves, still a big slap in the face to Oompa Loompa in charge. So one can see how similar some of this is in syntax to Walt Whitman and some of the braggadocious nature that to this day Chicago kind of feels, the pride of it. But how uniquely simple the language is and different to something you would have read at the style at that point. Usually it would be just honestly like over-the-top, grandiose language and nature, and you would have to really try to decipher what the person is saying, and you don't have to do that at all. 2 years after publishing Chicago Poems, Cornhuskers was published by the same publisher. For this, he won his first Pulitzer Prize. This was actually a Pulitzer Prize special citation and award for poetry. It's kind of like he won a Pulitzer, but they weren't giving out Pulitzers for poetry until 1922, 3 years later. So the Poetry Society funded the award and told the Pulitzer Society, here, can we just put your name on it and we'll fund it? It's like sleeping with a woman when you are a bag over your head. It still counts.
Who's wearing the bag?
Well, it'd be you. It's an Andy Samberg joke. I stole it straight from you, Andy Samberg. Yeah, there you go. He won the award specifically for his use of simple language, his break from traditional form, and his coverage of American life. Cornhusker specifically was more about rural America and the farmers in America. And also, this was something obviously he witnessed firsthand as a child and as a young man. In the following year, he returned back to his roots of writing and wrote Smoke and Steel, again about Chicago and his attempt to capture American industrialization, which must have been a wild thing to experience to live there at the time. This was 1920, and in 1922, he published another poetry book called Slabs of a Sunburnt West, which is just a cool name in my view. And one great poem is called The Windy City, and a short poem I recommend is called Improved Farmland, both about Chicago and building a city on old farmland, respectively. He would publish a selected version of his works a few years later and then pause publishing poetry until 1928 with Good Morning America. And other than the selected works and the Cornhuskers, I own and read all of them, and I mean, they're great. They're great poems. Any questions so far? Because I'm just listing through a bunch of shit.
How old is he at this point? Is he like in his 50s, 60s?
Late 30s, early 40s, I think. Let's see here. He was born on, if I remember correct, 1878, and this is 1922, so 45. Is that the math going there?
Good enough for literature work.
Surprisingly, I was a math guy in high school until I wasn't. But we are getting a little ahead of ourselves right now, right? Because Carl isn't just a poet. He's a journalist as well. It's what he's getting paid to do. And in 1918 and 1990 are two big years for journalists. Sandburg was hired by the Newspaper Enterprise Association to travel to Norway and Sweden as a correspondent covering World War, the prequel, though, again, the only source that mentions this is the National Park Service website. And between his normal job, writing poetry, having a young family, moving a bunch, and going on a ship to Scandinavia and back, Carl was a busy man. Something that I can 100% verify is his coverage of the 1990 Chicago race riots. Now, have you heard of these at all?
Yeah, is this concurrent with the Haymarket riots, or is it like part of the same summer of discontent?
Yeah, it's part of the Red Summer, but it's tied in a way, but it's a little different. I don't know how exactly you would tie them in, but the atmosphere can breed that kind of stuff. And it's America, so nothing is not tied together. This is just what the website description is. Quote, "The summer's riots were fueled by simmering tensions and sparked by the stoning and drowning of a black teenager named Eugene Williams. Williams had been on a raft with friends when they floated across the line dividing the white and black beaches. George Stober, a 24-year-old white man, began throwing rocks at the youths. One rock struck Williams, who fell off the raft and drowned. The police at the murder scene refused to arrest Stober. The riots began, big surprise there, right? The riots began at the bench on July 27th and lasted until August 3rd, where 38 people were killed and 537 injured during the Chicago race riots. The violence ended after the National Guard had to be called. Deadly racial riots had occurred across the United States during 1919's Red Summer. Many considered the Chicago race riots the worst." Unquote. Dark stuff. Sandburg would interview everybody about the riots, both black and white, speaking mostly to people on the ground and not hidden away in some penthouse like, some Associated Press journalists do today when they see, I don't know, just a normal protest and they call it a riot and then they go, I'm so scared about all these Antifa. He talked to union workers, regular workers, union officials, and leaders of the NAACP. He would first publish articles that would later be organized into a pamphlet simply called The Chicago Race Riots of 1919. His reporting had been considered one of the area's greatest examples of unbiased reporting. Here are some examples of the excerpts from the pamphlet. But before that, do you have any comments, Davis? Because this is just interesting stuff.
It's amazing how it repeats, but hey, at least we're not wearing hijabs.
Not yet, anyway. Bomb, 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 Iran. Bomb, 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 Iran. Okay, so here's some exact excerpts, because we're not talking about John McCain here. Yeah, I mean, right, like, they've been saying this forever. It's not just Trump. It's like it's always been a Republican thing.
Yeah, it's beyond a Republican thing. It's always been a fucking thing.
Whatever. Yeah, it's mind-blowing. Fucking mind-blowing. Okay, quote. On the one hand, we have blind, lawless government failing to function through policemen ignorant of Lincoln, the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and a theory sanctioned and baptized in a storm of red blood. And on the other hand, we have a gaunt, involuntary poverty from which issues the hoodlum, unquote.
The more things don't change, the more they stay the same.
He also wrote, quote, in any American city where the racial situation is critical at this moment, the radical and active factors are probably 1, housing, 2, politics and war psychology, and 3, organization of labor.
The more things don't change, the more they stay the same.
I mean, yeah, this is 115 years, 16 years ago. A lot of familiar themes. I will now add that he does have a poem in the Chicago Poems book that is, the title is just the N-word. However, I will say it's a poem written in the first person, and the voice of the narrator wants recognition for the good that he brought to American society from music, dance, food, and laughter now prevalent in all parts of America, while trying to point out what the evil's done on the entire group of people and his family. Well, just the people he's part of. You wouldn't be able to get away with that now, definitely not, but it could be viewed also as a white person's view of black people in the 1910s, but to say it was a racist thing is simply inaccurate. It was just trying a representation in his own view of somebody he saw in Chicago at the time.
Everyone's a product of their time, their time and place, and you can excuse that to however extent you're comfortable, but that certainly doesn't sound like a hard R type scenario.
Poetry and journalism wasn't the only thing Carl Sandburg wrote, because in the early 1920s, he began to write and collect a series of children's stories, which would ultimately be called the Rutabaga stories, which the timeline here directly correlates when his 3 daughters were getting to the age where they would love fairy tales. At this point, causation definitely causes correlation. He even added characters named Swipe, Spink, and Skabooch, which were the 3 nicknames he gave his daughters.
Nice.
God, I would hate to be the Skabooch. These stories, sometimes whimsical, sometimes melancholic, often used nonsense like baby language and were meant to be American versions of fairy tales with skyscrapers and corn fairies and farms and sidewalks, because Carl believed that the European fairy tales with knights and kings and castles didn't seem appropriate for American children. I think the last story he wrote was in 1930. I might be incorrect, which, again, a little bit of causation and correlation here with his kids growing up. Carl Sandburg also clearly had a passion for music. From the very first poem we read, we talked about a guitar maker from Italy, which many of his poems include themes of music like I just referenced. He began to compile folk songs of all sorts, and in 1927, the American Song Bag was published by Harcourt, Brace and Company. It was incredibly popular from the beginning, and it was published annually for the next 70 years, which is impressive. If anybody can get a copy in like a hand on that, please let me know, because I would love one. And it's also available online if you want one, but it's really difficult in my view to read a songbook online. It's difficult to read anything online, but especially that. It's about 500 pages long, so it is massive and includes lyrics and notes and brief explanations of the song's origins. It's considered a genuine American classic of musicology, and honestly, it's a national treasure.
Did he ever like link up with Alan Lomax? Like, I imagine he's probably a precursor, but is there any crossover there?
I have no clue, but I would find it hard that like Lomax would probably have been influenced by him in some way. Carl also was obsessed with Abraham Lincoln. It makes sense. He's a poor immigrant. Dude, I made that joke here. He's a poor immigrant's son, grew up in Illinois, lived in a town where the Lincoln-Douglas debates occur, was an abolitionist and always on the correct side of the civil rights movement. This led him to probably the thing that gave him the largest amount of fame and accreditation out of all of his writings. His 6-volume biography of our 16th president. It is widely considered one of the, if not the most influential books about Abraham Lincoln, and it took decades of work to accomplish it. In fact, he even won his second Pulitzer Prize. This one was a real one, not funded by the Poetry Society, for history in 1940 for his work on this. But like most works of, well, I'm going to put this in quotations, history, it has its problems. Let's chat about it. Why? You want any questions yet?
Yeah, but let's see what he's got to say.
Well, it's mostly what other people have to say, because right off the bat when he published it, people were like, yeah, we can't, this isn't like real history because of the way that history books are written. The first of the 2 books are called The Prairie Years, published in 1926, obviously when he was a little younger, with the remaining 4 being The War Years, which came out 13 years later. The books are known for being written in a poetic prose, easy to read and flourishly written. However, many historians and critics have pointed out that the lack of original research, lack of first-person sources outside of his letters, and uncritical writing doesn't really make a reputable biography. Nor does it the fact that the list of acknowledgments and sources in the war years was so short that one critic said it was almost useless, which what this reads as to me is that other people who share his opinion, he is just a fanboy writing an enormous collection on a person he admired, and though it is an extensive collection, much of it is reused material, and as much as it has to be questioned, I for one cannot and will not claim my scripts are true biographies. This is ridiculous. Of course, I spend a couple of days researching and using mostly secondhand accounts, as he did. There are a number of factual errors in the book, specifically about Lincoln's portrayal being in cornfields and working, and about the Black Hawk Wars that were known at the time. It was a collection of books that really wanted to portray a myth rather than the man, which is similar to a lot of other things that were written about Abraham Lincoln. Like, remember that when we talked about Dale Carnegie? Similar to that. Any questions so far?
So is hagiography as old as just fucking biographies in general?
I mean, if you think about like the myth building of that, probably, yeah. Like it's there's some accounts about from the historians who like critique him as just like he just focused really on writing a beautiful story, which fine. Totally fine. You don't, if you're an anthropologist, you don't fucking read Jared Diamond, right?
Just trying to talk my mom down off the Jared Diamond ledge not 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, we'll talk about Jared Diamond eventually. I mean, he's probably still alive, so we don't want to get sued for slander, but not the most reputable anthropologist. So I bring this up because a very famous or infamous, and trust me, these guys would like to use that word, podcasted a 4-parter on the assassination of Abe Lincoln, and they directly referenced something that Carl Sandburg wrote about a close relationship Abraham Lincoln had with another male. Simply put, Lincoln, as a young man, shared a bed for multiple years with another man, which, though it sounds strange to think of now, it wasn't uncommon back then, as it was a way to save money on rooming, frankly. You now have another person to share a bed to, which also save money on heat. Even platonically, there are many reasons why you would share a bed with somebody to save money, right? Like, Davis, not to be weird, but we've shared beds before at hotel rooms.
That we have, and particularly back when mattresses were so much less abundant, less hotel rooms, less everything, it makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, and like, I don't want to pay $350 a night for a fucking, just gimpy-ass queen bed. Yeah. Well, Carl Sandburg wrote about this relationship, and this is the direct quote, having a streak of the lavender, which was a euphemism up until basically the 60s about gay relationships. So, sure, it could have happened. Sexuality is a spectrum. We don't judge on this podcast. In fact, we speak about people's sexuality often on this show because it is a core tenet of a human being. And having stated outright, if we thought somebody was gay in the past, even when they weren't, they didn't say that they were to anybody. An example of this, we did Major Archibald Butt. However, Carl Sandburg did not ever comment or expand or even say anything past this comment, like ever. Whenever asked, he just didn't answer the question. Nor is there much proof otherwise, whereas there is proof that Major Archibald Butt shared living quarters and was frequently around other gay men, was sleeping with people who were absolutely gay at the time. In my view, I think Carl Sandburg did the modern equivalent of just going, "Ha! Gay!" and spiraled out of control, which culminated in another book about Lincoln's presumed sexual life that came out in 2005 by a person named C.A. Tripp, who, to put in the Lost in the Library canon, was a direct prodigy of Alfred Kinsey and an openly gay man himself. He took a bunch of circumstantial evidence and made it fact, so much so that the person he was writing the book with he dropped out of the project and was openly against its publication because his old partner said it had no historical fact. He was trying to draw a conclusion out of something that wasn't there.
Oh, just the old shoot the arrow, then draw the bullseye after the fact.
So, what's the lesson here, right? Maybe just don't say offhand comments because they could be misconstrued. This is America. Don't catch you tripping up. Fuck that shit, right? That lesson will never be learned. And Franklin, even if a few comments like this are in the book series, the impacts of the books made from Carl Sandburg beyond, being a big name poet, the interest of Abe Lincoln popular again. If there was such thing as the U.S. of motherfucking A, now he is a household name for both poetry, history, and just books in general now. And my gripe here isn't with Carl Sandburg. It's with the three grown men who I don't believe are homophobic. They just took admittedly circumstantial evidence and decided to make 3 full episodes, 90 minutes long, all about gay jokes with Abraham Lincoln after one dubious statement. And they claim themselves to be a history podcast. It's a little insulting to listeners and definitely to the gay community if you think about it, right? Okay. Whatever. Fucking off my soapbox. Because it's 1945. Carl Sandburg and family have moved to Canamera Farms. I think that's out in North Carolina. It's near the city of Flat Rock. And this is where he would spend the rest of his life. He made this estate his home. It's like 256 acres or something crazy like that. And something like a third of all his poetry would be written here. It even became a National Historic Site after his death, with Lillian taking the charge here. So that's why we have so much information readily available by him. We aren't done talking about Sandburg's accomplishments, though. So any questions yet before we get to 3 pretty huge things, honestly, that we have to just gloss over to finish the podcast?
Did he have defined eras, or is it more just constant growth? I start with poetry, and then I add the journalism, and then I add the children's stories, and then continuing down all those branches? Or does he sort of this is my poetry phase, this is my journalism phase, this is my short story phase?
I mean, he basically writes poetry all his life, right? The children's book phase were basically the era when his kids would be reading the children's book, right? He would end that in 1930. I think that was an 8-year phase. Journalism, he would come off and on again, and he would write different essays too and get published. He also had a short phase towards the end of his life, right before he passed away, which I didn't add in the script, where he was on the set for a movie as either a writer or what are they called? Somebody who you ask questions for. But he was somebody on set for that. That was way towards the end of his life in his 80s. In the music phase, he would just once in a while do a music thing, but the poetry was the through line through and through, and his obsession with Lincoln basically all his life as well, though the writing just was in one section.
So that was his whole life. That wasn't his equivalent of 40-year-olds getting the World War II bug and just getting obsessions.
I mean, it was around when he was 40, though. So yeah, that was his midlife crisis. So now we still have to talk about when he won his third Pulitzer, he won a Grammy, and was commemorated by the NAACP and some of his namesakes, because pretty much all of his life he just was successful from here on in too. To begin with, he was awarded another Pulitzer, like I said, for his collected works, his second one for poetry, and his third overall. I do find it odd that Pulitzers are given out to basically what amounts to a music anthology. Like, you don't get Grammys or Oscars for that other than like a Lifetime Achievement Award, but whatever. They hand out the awards. I don't. In 1959, he was awarded a Grammy for Best Performance, Documentary or Spoken Word, other than comedy, and for his recordings of Abraham Lincoln's speeches that he recorded in New York. So, yeah, still doing Abraham shit. He recorded Aaron Copland's Lincoln Portrait along with the New York Philharmonic. And because of his best-selling bios and this recording, it's suggested by historians that more Americans learned about Abraham Lincoln from Carl Sandburg than any other source, which kind of makes sense at this point, right? And he probably was pretty gifted. I mean, you had the New York Philharmonic behind you, but like, you won a Grammy for it, right?
Yeah, no, he probably is exactly how all our grandparents and parents were educated on Lincoln.
The last commemoration we will chat about is when the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, right, the NAACP, awarded Carl Sandburg their silver plaque, which was given to him as, quote, major prophet of civil rights in our time, unquote, and came with a lifetime membership to the NAACP, which is pretty rad. This was awarded in like 1965, actually in 1965, not like because, nothing going on about the civil rights movement or any important sit-ins or marches happening on this time and civil justice history or anything like that, right? It's 1965, known calm year. There are lots of places named after him, like a community college in his hometown of Galesburg, a few libraries, confusingly a suburb and a mall. My favorite one that I forgot and I relearned about this was the Sufjan Stevens song, or Sufjan Stevens, excuse me, from the album Illinois, which I think is probably their more famous, one of the most famous ones off the record. And in all hipster fashion, it's incredibly long. It's named, Come On, Feel the Illinois, Part 1, The World's Columbian Exposition, Part 2, Carl Sandburg Visits Me in a Dream. Carl Sandburg, I just mixed Carl Sandburg and Andy Samberg's name, and now it sounds like a delicious burger that fucking Bob's Burger should have done at one point. The Carl Sandburger mixed with a little bit of social justice and just a ton of Chicago pastrami.
All the kale.
So Carl Sandburg passed away on July 26, 1969, at the age of 89 in his home in Flat Rock, North Carolina. It was due to natural causes. He's 89 years old. Sure. He was cremated. And like I previously mentioned, his home is now a National Historic Site thanks to the efforts of his wife Lillian, or as Carl Sandburg called her, Paula. Any questions before I do sources and anything of that sort? The last thing I want to note is that this kind of seems strange to me, but he kind of looks like Cillian Murphy when he's young, and then he develops slowly into Steve Martin in The Jerk. So
no, he's just another fascinating case study about how it's possible to be on the right side of history, even when you say people are a product of their times. Not always.
I mean, he kind of isn't product of the times in the sense that, he grew up in a town and influenced by people, educated. That definitely had something. Plus, his parents seemed like pretty chill people too.
Obviously, everyone's affected by their environment, but it's a canard to assume that that's just how everyone talked back then. That's just what everyone thought.
All right, yeah, sources here, right? National Park Service website articles about the Chicago race riot in 1919 and his coverage there, as well as the timeline of his life. Poetry Foundation and the Poets.org articles on his life. Carl Sandburg and the Steichens, the Wisconsin Years by Faith B. Miracle. Again, what a name. Chicago Poems with the intro by John E. Halwis. The 3-book collection I have with Smoke and Steel, Slabs of the Sunburnt West, and Good Morning America, as well as The American Sandbag and In Reckless Ecstasy, all by Carl Sandburg himself, obviously. Inventory of the Oliver Barrett Carl Sandburg papers, 1860 to 1966, taken from Newbury, USAHistory.com article of him. Broken Promises, Plagiarism, Misused Evidence, and the New Gay Lincoln book published by the Free Press, written by Philip Nobile, who is Tripp's researcher partner before he quit, obviously. Sandburg's Lincoln Within History by James Hurt. Let's see, Sandburg's Hometown.com. Working Man's Poet by Danny Heitman, taken from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The Baltimore Afro-American newspaper found on the Wayback Machine about his NAACP award, and some wiki articles just to round out some information to make this story better. By the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, the Rutabaga Stories, Edward Steichen, and of course, referenced Carl Sandburg himself. Plugging my Patreon, that's Lost in the Library Podcast on Patreon. Also, any questions, please send to the Lost in the Library Podcast at gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram, again, Lost in the Library there. I have a Substack you can read at my work at Fil Deptula. That's just my name. Just slowly building those out. I'm going to end this with one last short poem by him called Sunsets, but do you have any last comments, Davis?
No, I think this is the first non-problematic person I have been on the podcast for.
Yeah, it's not the first non-problematic person we've discussed, but this isn't a podcast about the worst people in all of history or about serial killers or about stupid Americans, right? So,
well, listen, if you're going to make people read, you're already pretty far down the list.
True. So, sunsets. There are sunsets who whisper a goodbye. It is a short dusk and a wait for stars. Prairie and sea rim, they go level and even, and they sleep is easy. There are sunsets who dance goodbye. They fling scarves half the arc, top the arc, then over the arc, ribbons in the ears, sashes at the hips, dancing, dancing goodbye, and here sleep tosses a little with dreams.